In a room full of Sacramento's elite, an elderly black woman they tried to turn away holds the key to understanding the true legacy of the city's most powerful man and the secret he kept for 60 years. Margaret Johnson stood at the entrance of the Sterling funeral home, her weathered hands clutching a worn leather purse. At 82, she had attended more funerals than she cared to count, but this one was different. The parking lot was filled with luxury cars, and well-dressed mourners streamed past her as if she were invisible. No one held the door for the elderly black woman in her simple Sunday best. Inside, the funeral home's grand parlor was packed with Sacramento's elite, all gathered to mourn Charles Wellington III, one of the city's most prominent real estate developers. The air was thick with expensive perfume and artificial sympathy. Margaret observed as people exchanged hushed conversations about Charles's business empire, his charitable donations, and his picture-perfect family seated in the front row. When Margaret approached the guest book, a stern-faced funeral director intercepted her. "The service is private, ma'am," he said, emphasizing the last word with barely concealed disdain. "Family and invited guests only." "I'm here for Charles," Margaret replied softly, her voice steady despite the hurt. "Perhaps you have the wrong service." The funeral director's suggestion carried clear implications. A few nearby mourners turned to stare, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Charles's widow, Elizabeth Wellington, elegant in her black designer dress, glanced over but quickly looked away, whispering something to her adult children. Margaret settled into the hard wooden pew in the last row of the funeral home, her aged hands folded neatly in her lap. From this vantage point, she could observe the entire gathering, a sea of expensive suits and designer dresses that rippled with whispered conversations and subtle glances in her direction. The afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscope patterns that seemed to mock the somber occasion with their cheerful dance across the polished floor. She watched as late arrivals hurried to find seats, noting how they would rather squeeze into already crowded rows than sit anywhere near her. The space around her remained conspicuously empty, like an invisible force field that repelled the other mourners. A young woman in a navy business suit had started to sit nearby, but her companion had tugged her elbow, whispered something, and led her to a different section. Margaret had seen this dance before, the subtle choreography of exclusion that she had witnessed countless times throughout her 82 years. The service began with a sophistication that Charles would have found amusing. Margaret remembered how he used to joke about the pretentiousness of his social circle, usually while sharing coffee with her in the quiet of his study during those early morning hours when she would arrive to clean. Now, watching the procession of speakers approach the podium, she could almost hear his dry chuckle at the performance unfolding before them. First came the business partners, each trying to outdo the last with stories of Charles's business acumen. They spoke of billion-dollar deals and visionary developments, but none mentioned the small acts of kindness that Margaret knew were his true legacy. One partner boasted about Charles's first major property acquisition, unaware that the down payment had come from Charles selling his beloved classic car, a detail he had shared with Margaret over morning coffee, his eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of a secret well kept. The charity board members followed, their speeches a parade of donation amounts and building dedications. Margaret listened as they praised his public generosity, knowing they had no idea about the countless, anonymous donations he had made to families in need. She remembered the Christmas Eve when she had caught him secretly dropping off gifts at her neighbor's house, knowing the single mother there was struggling to provide for her children. He had made her promise never to tell, saying with a wink that Santa's helpers had to keep their secrets. As she sat through the carefully crafted eulogies, Margaret noticed Elizabeth Wellington dab at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief. The widow's grief seemed genuine, but her periodic glances toward Margaret betrayed her unease at the unexpected guest. Their eyes met briefly, and Margaret offered a gentle smile, knowing that soon Elizabeth would understand everything. The children's tributes were the hardest to hear. They painted a picture of a perfect father, always present, unfailingly supportive, a moral compass in their lives. Margaret didn't doubt their sincerity, but she knew they had missed the deeper lessons of their father's life. As they spoke of his success, but not of the struggles that had shaped his character. They praised his integrity in business, but knew nothing of the quiet integrity he had shown in keeping his promises to those society would have allowed him to forget. Throughout the service, Margaret could feel the funeral director hovering nearby, his presence a constant reminder that she was considered an unwelcome intruder. He moved about the room with practiced efficiency, but his path always seemed to lead back to where she sat, as if he were a guard dog keeping watch over a suspicious package. She noticed him checking his watch repeatedly, likely eager to escort her out before the private reception began. The air in the funeral home grew heavier as the service progressed, thick with perfume and unspoken questions about her presence. Margaret could hear the whispers, see the speculative glances, feel the weight of assumptions pressing down like the lid of a coffin. But she remained still, her posture straight despite her years, her dignity intact despite their dismissal. She had learned patience in her long life, and she knew that timing was everything. She thought about the letter in her purse, its creases softened by decades of careful folding and unfolding. She had debated whether to bring it, whether to share this piece of Charles with his family and social circle. But in the end, she knew it was what he would have wanted. Charles had always believed that truth, like cream, eventually rises to the top. As the final speaker concluded, and the funeral director began moving in her direction with clear purpose, Margaret felt a calm certainty settle over her. She had waited decades to share this story, had kept Charles's secret through all the years of their unlikely friendship. A few more minutes of waiting wouldn't matter. She rose slowly, deliberately, her movement drawing all eyes in the room. The time for waiting was over. The truth, like a long-held breath, was ready to be released. In that moment, as she began her walk to the podium, Margaret thought about how Charles had always said that the most important moments in life come not with fanfare, but with quiet determination. She was about to prove him right, one last time. The air in the funeral home crackled with tension as Margaret made her way to the podium. Her footsteps, slow but purposeful, echoed through the suddenly silent room. The plush carpet did little to muffle the sound of her sensible shoes, the same shoes she'd worn for years of honest work, now carrying her toward a moment 6 decades in the making. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a strength that belied her years. The microphone picked up her words, amplifying them across the room. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the leather and wooden pews creaking beneath their designer clothes. The funeral director stood frozen halfway down the aisle, his earlier determination to remove her now replaced by uncertainty. Elizabeth Wellington's face tightened with barely concealed distress. She half rose from her seat in the front row, her perfectly manicured hand gripping the pew in front of her. Her children, Charles's pride and joy, exchanged worried glances, clearly concerned about this unexpected interruption to their carefully orchestrated farewell. "I have something to say about Charles Wellington," Margaret continued, her chin held high. She could see the assumptions racing through their minds. Was she a disgruntled former employee? A victim of some long-ago business deal? Their faces showed a mix of fear and morbid curiosity about what scandal might be about to unfold. The weighted silence of the room pressed against her as she adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses. "In 1963, I was a maid in the Wellington household." She paused, letting the words sink in. Some of the older attendees shifted uncomfortably, no doubt remembering those times and their own household staff from that era. Charles was just starting his business then, working from a tiny office above his father's shop. Every day I'd bring him coffee and lunch while he worked into the night. Margaret's weathered hands reached into her purse, pulling out an envelope that had clearly been treasured for years. The paper had yellowed with age, its creases soft from countless careful foldings and unfoldings. A few people leaned forward in their seats, their earlier disdain replaced by reluctant interest. One night, there was a fire in that building. Her voice took on a distant quality, as if she were watching the scene unfold before her eyes once again. Everyone had gone home, except Charles, who had fallen asleep at his desk. I was cleaning late, saw the smoke, and got him out. She unfolded the envelope with careful movements, her fingers trembling slightly. He was unconscious, but I managed to save him and his briefcase of contracts, the deals that would eventually build his empire. From within the envelope, she withdrew a yellowed newspaper clipping, holding it up for all to see. The black and white photograph showed a much younger Margaret standing outside a burned building, her face smudged with soot, but her expression determined. The Wellington children were now leaning forward, their eyes fixed on the photograph. Their father had never mentioned this incident, this woman, this piece of their family history that had remained hidden for so long. Elizabeth Wellington's expression had shifted from concern to something more complex, a mixture of recognition and dawning understanding. "Charles wrote me this letter the next day," Margaret continued, her voice softening with memory as she pulled out a carefully preserved piece of paper. "He promised he'd never forget, and for 60 years, he kept that promise." The letter in her hands was written in Charles's distinctive handwriting, the same script that had signed countless contracts and business deals, but these words were different. They were personal, heartfelt, and spoke of a debt that could never be repaid. The paper bore witness to a side of Charles Wellington that none of his business associates or social peers had ever seen. In that moment, the dynamic in the room shifted palpably. The invisible barrier that had separated Margaret from the other mourners began to dissolve. The truth she carried wasn't a scandal to be feared, but a testament to the real character of the man they had gathered to remember. She wasn't an intruder at this funeral. She was perhaps the one person who had known a side of Charles Wellington that his public persona had never revealed. Elizabeth Wellington's face had softened, tears welling in her eyes as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began to fall into place. The mysterious appointments her husband had kept, the quiet visits to the bank, the personal checks he had written, they all suddenly made sense. Her children, too, seemed to be seeing their father in a new light, understanding that their perfect parent had been even more extraordinary than they had known. The revelation hung in the air like a benediction, transforming what could have been a moment of scandal into something far more profound, a glimpse into the true heart of a man who had understood that real greatness lies not in public accolades, but in the quiet moments of human connection and kept promises. Margaret's voice took on a gentle, almost musical quality as she continued her story, her words falling like soft rain on the captivated audience. The harsh fluorescent lights of the funeral home seemed to soften, creating an intimate atmosphere as she shared the truth she had carried for so long. "Every month since that fire, without fail, Charles sent money to help my family," she revealed, her words carrying no hint of boast or demand. But it wasn't just money. It was hope, opportunity, and most importantly, friendship. She paused, looking directly at Elizabeth Wellington, whose tears now flowed freely. "He never once missed a month, not in 60 years. Even when his business was struggling in the early days, he would show up at my door, envelope in hand, saying, 'A promise is a promise, Margaret.'" The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. The same people who had dismissed her presence earlier now hung on her every word, their previous prejudices dissolving in the face of this extraordinary testament to Charles's character. "My oldest daughter, Ruby, dreamed of becoming a doctor," Margaret continued, her voice swelling with maternal pride. "When I told Charles, he didn't hesitate. The next day, he set up a college fund. 'Education is the key to breaking barriers,' he told me, and barriers were made to be broken." She smiled at the memory. "Ruby is now chief of surgery at Boston General. My son Michael graduated from law school, and my youngest, Sarah, became an architect, all because Charles believed in the power of giving people a chance." Several of the business associates in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps remembering times they had boasted about their own charitable giving, while cameras flashed. Charles's philanthropy had been different, quiet, personal, and transformative. "When my grandson Marcus wanted to start his own business," Margaret continued, her eyes twinkling, "Charles became his silent investor. He met with Marcus every month, not just to discuss business, but to mentor him, to share the lessons he'd learned over his lifetime. 'Success means nothing if we don't lift others as we climb,' he would say." Elizabeth Wellington nodded slowly, recognition dawning on her face. "The Tuesday meetings," she whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "He always said they were with a promising young entrepreneur." Margaret smiled warmly at Elizabeth. "Charles was insistent about keeping this private. He told me, 'Margaret, sometimes the greatest acts of kindness are the ones we keep to ourselves.' He believed that true charity wasn't about recognition or tax deductions. It was about making a real difference in people's lives." She reached into her purse once more and withdrew a small, worn photograph. It showed Charles at a graduation ceremony, standing proudly next to Margaret's children. "This was taken at Ruby's medical school graduation," she explained. Charles came to every graduation, every major milestone. He sat in the back, quiet and unassuming, but he was there. He became part of our family's story, just as we became part of his. The Wellington children were openly crying now, seeing a side of their father they had never known. The son, Charles IV, reached for his mother's hand, squeezing it gently as recognition flickered across his face. "The Christmas Eve appointments," he said softly. Dad would always disappear for a few hours on Christmas Eve, saying he had an important tradition to maintain. Margaret nodded. Every Christmas Eve for 60 years, he would come to our family dinner. He'd sit at our table, eat my sweet potato pie, and listen to the children's stories. No pretense, no business talk, just family. "These moments," he would say, "are worth more than all the buildings I've ever built." Her voice grew softer, more intimate. "I'm not here to claim anything or cause trouble. Everything Charles did for my family was documented, planned for, and will continue through the trust he set up. I'm here because he was my friend, a true friend who saw past colour, past class, past all the artificial barriers that society puts up. I'm here because he showed me that real greatness isn't in the buildings we build or the wealth we accumulate, but in the lives we touch and the promises we keep." The room was completely still now, every person present absorbing the profound truth about the man they thought they had known. This wasn't just a story about charity or obligation, it was a testament to genuine human connection, to the power of keeping one's word, and to the quiet way that real change happens in the world. Elizabeth Wellington rose from her seat, her designer dress rustling as she walked toward Margaret. Her face showed no trace of the earlier suspicion or discomfort, only understanding and gratitude. The truth had not diminished Charles's memory. It had enhanced it, revealing the full measure of the man they had gathered to remember. The silence that filled the Sterling funeral home was different now, no longer tense or judgmental, but filled with a profound sense of understanding and revelation. Elizabeth Wellington's embrace of Margaret sent ripples through the assembled crowd, transforming the atmosphere from one of exclusion to one of acceptance and admiration. "He told me about you last year," Elizabeth whispered into Margaret's ear, her voice thick with emotion. "It was during his final days in the hospital. He wanted to make sure we'd continue to honour his promise." She pulled back slightly, her tear-stained face showing a mix of gratitude and regret. "I'm sorry we didn't welcome you properly earlier. I didn't understand then." The Wellington children approached next, forming a small circle around Margaret and their mother. Charles IV, the eldest, spoke first. "Dad always taught us about integrity," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Now I understand he wasn't just teaching. He was living it every day, in ways we never knew." Sarah Wellington, the youngest, reached for Margaret's hand. Would you tell us more about him? About the side of our father we never got to see?" The question held years of curiosity and a genuine desire to know the complete story of the man they had lost. The other funeral attendees began to move closer, their earlier aloofness replaced by genuine interest. The funeral director, who had been so eager to remove Margaret earlier, now stood back respectfully, his face showing a mixture of embarrassment and awe. Margaret watched as several of Charles's business partners exchanged uncomfortable glances. These were men who had boasted about their charitable foundations and public donations, who had posed for photos at fundraising galas. Yet here was a story of true philanthropy, quiet, consistent, and deeply personal, that put their public displays to shame. A prominent local politician who had eulogized Charles earlier approached Margaret. "I served on 3 charitable boards with Charles," he admitted, "but I never knew this side of him. He never mentioned any of this during our fundraising campaigns." Margaret smiled gently. "That wasn't his way," she replied. "Charles believed that true charity shouldn't be about recognition. He used to tell me, 'The moment you announce your good deeds is the moment they become about you instead of the people you're helping.'" The reception that followed was nothing like what had been planned. Instead of the usual formal gathering where people exchanged business cards and discussed real estate developments, small groups formed around Margaret as she shared stories about the Charles Wellington they never knew. She told them about the Christmas Eve dinners, about his mentorship of her grandson, about the way he would slip away from high society functions to attend her children's graduations. Elizabeth Wellington cancelled the catered reception and instead ordered pizza for everyone, something she revealed Charles would have preferred anyway. He always said the best conversations happen over simple food, she explained, smiling through her tears. As the afternoon wore on, something remarkable happened. The artificial barriers of race and class that had been so evident at the beginning of the funeral began to dissolve. Charles's high society friends found themselves sitting on folding chairs next to Margaret's family members, who had arrived after hearing she was finally sharing their story. They shared slices of pizza and stories, learning about a man who had lived two lives, one in the spotlight as a successful businessman and another as a quiet force for change in one family's life. Before leaving, Margaret placed something on Charles's casket, a piece of the old newspaper from the night of the fire, framed alongside a recent photo of her entire family. "This is your real legacy," she whispered. "Not the buildings, not the money, but the lives you changed." As she walked out of the funeral home that evening, Margaret was no longer the invisible woman who had arrived that morning. People held the door for her, asked for her contact information, and expressed genuine desire to stay in touch. Several of Charles's business partners approached her grandson Marcus about potential collaborations, having learned of his successful business venture. Elizabeth insisted on having Margaret and her family over for dinner the following weekend, eager to begin bridging the gap between their two worlds. "Charles would have wanted this," she said. "He spent 60 years building a bridge between our families. It's time we all walked across it." The story of Charles Wellington and Margaret Johnson began spreading through Sacramento's elite circles, not as scandal, but as inspiration. It challenged people to question their assumptions, to look beyond surface appearances, and to consider what true legacy means. As Margaret settled into her daughter's car for the ride home, she looked back at the funeral home one last time. She could almost hear Charles's gentle chuckle, could almost see him winking at her as he used to do when sharing one of their secrets. "Well, old friend," she whispered, "I kept my promise too. I waited until the right moment to tell them who you really were." The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, but for once, Margaret wasn't invisible in them. She had stepped into the light, carrying with her a truth that would continue to illuminate lives long after this day had passed.